Welcome to the world of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Gingerino, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode today. I'm really delighted to have everyone come along with me as we go through the lore of the Pillars of Eternity world as Avowed goes under development. For those not in the know, Avowed and Pillars of Eternity share the same fantasy setting, the world of Eora. And so as the theory goes, if we dive into the history, lore, and mechanics of the Pillars of Eternity games, we'll be able to get some insights into Avowed as it undergoes development, as well as geek out about a really awesome fantasy world that a lot of us already love in Pillars of Eternity. There's still not a lot of news to cover, and so we're just going to be jumping straight into the lore as normal. And our topic today will be the goddess of death, Berath.
You have a choice, Watcher. Your soul has wandered into the beyond. Your options are to serve me in pursuit of Aethys, or to accept death and be returned to the wheel.
Now, I mentioned before the transition that Berath is called the goddess of death, and that name is true, that title is very accurate, but I think it's a little bit misleading. Because when we hear something like the goddess of death, I think we get sort of a different idea in our head about what this god is versus what Berath really is. Well, first off, Berath is not a she. Berath is an it. I'm very likely going to refer to Berath as a she a few times, and that's just because we interact with a manifestation of the god, and it appears as a woman. But aside from just that, it's also a little bit misleading to call Berath the goddess of death, because I don't know about you guys, but I picture, a hooded figure in robes and is a skeleton, kind of like a Grim Reaper sort of thing, or this like angel with skeleton wings or something, or this armor-clad warrior in some sort of underworld that's watching the souls as they suffer. That's the idea I think of when I hear god or goddess of death. And that is nothing like what Berath is or who Berath is. Berath is deity over death, that's for sure. But it's not the only domain that Berath is in charge of. Berath is god of death and of cycles and of doorways or portals and inevitability as well as mortality. Those are the 6 main domains that Berath is in charge of, that it is the deity over. And as with all the gods, these domains are an expression of the nature of the god. It's not so much their duty, like they were ascribed to do these things. An expression of their nature lets them be the deity over certain things. Berath has an affinity towards the cyclical nature of Eora, and so Berath will be associated with cycles. But whether or not Berath would be in charge of something like the water cycle, I don't know. That might be Hylia or Andra, probably Andra, when I think about it. But anyways, I'm getting aside for that. These domains are really displayed well when we start to look at Berath's names. So Berath goes by the name Berath in the nation of Aedyr. It's the Aedyran name for that deity. But if you went to a different location in the world, you would see different names for this god. And this is where we really unlock the meaning behind who Berath is. So let's actually take a dive into this. The first name that I want to look at is if we look at the item description of a cloak of Berath, which is typically found on a priest of Berath or someone who follows Berath in a religious fashion. On the cloak, it mentions that Berath is called the twinned god. And that's something you're going to understand why by the end of the episode. On this cloak as well, we can see the icon that is associated with Berath. It's a crude yet simple drawing of a skull with its mouth wide open, and inside the wide open mouth is a door or a keyhole or a key inside of a keyhole. And these are typically the images associated with Berath. But thinking more culturally, if you were to travel to a region of Eora called the Deadfire Archipelago, you would very likely run into the Huana people. The Huana people are a culture of people that typically live on the islands within the Deadfire Archipelago, and they have a different name and idea for Berath. The name that they ascribe to the god is Rikuhu. Now, Rikuhu is the name that they give the god, but Rikuhu is also a concept. It's also got like an illustration or some imagery to it. Rikuhu is this image of these 2 eels that are devouring each other at their tail. It's kind of like an Ouroboros, except instead of it being one snake or eel that's eating its own tail, it's two of them devouring each other's tail. So if you picture in your mind's eye these two eels, and they're devouring the tail of the other one, and they're forming a circle. On the upper half of this circle, there's an eel, and we're going to call this one Cahopa. Cahopa means overworld and life. That's what this eel represents. So, it's the physical world. It's where you and I are living kind of thing. It's the mundane existence where body and soul mix together. And the eel of Cahopa is devouring the tail of another eel, the bottom half of this circle, which is an eel called Tangaloa. Tangaloa, conversely, represents the underworld and death. So it represents the place that the souls will be after the body dies. It represents the state of death when there is no state of life. Now, that's all fine and dandy, it's like, we have these two eels are eating each other, and one is life and one is death. Yeah, it sounds like a mythology thing. But, to really, really understand and grasp and appreciate the imagery that's used here, we need to take a quick sidestep and talk about something called the wheel. Now, in the world of Eora, there is this cycle of rebirth that exists in the background of everything. It's essentially what we would understand reincarnation to be. So, if you are a kith person or a creature walking around Eora, when your body dies, the soul that occupies your body is uncoupled from your physical existence. To make a long story very short, the soul will then go to where the gods are in the beyond, that's capital B beyond, and it'll spend a time there before returning back to the physical world again to inhabit a new body and form new memories and new experiences. That is a very, very summarized version of what the wheel is, this process of reincarnation. It's given the name the wheel. And Berath is so associated to this process that it's often just called Berath's wheel because it oversees this process. And Berath's existence is now necessary for this process to even occur within Eora. It's a really vital process. See, now let's say that you were about to be born into Eora. In order for you to be born not hollow, that is, to have a soul, there has to be a soul somewhere for you to have. It doesn't just pop out of nowhere in this world. The soul that your body has comes from somewhere. And so where we get those souls from is the underworld, essentially. The place of death, the capital B beyond, where all the gods are. That's where some souls are. So when you're born, there's a soul that comes from the underworld, and it is coupled to your body, to put it crudely. But then how does that soul get to the underworld? Well, somebody else a long time ago had to die and have their soul released from their body and then go into the underworld so that you could have it in your new body. But that person who had died, they had to get a soul from the underworld when they were born, right? And so it's just this cycle that repeats. And so you see right there, the first domain of Berath cycles is really well represented with the wheel. This cycle of a body dying and the soul going into the underworld and then the soul coming back from the underworld to inhabit a new body. Now, I want to clarify, this is glossing over the deep, deep theology that is the wheel, and there's a lot that we can say about it, and we will in a different episodes, but for now, that's just all you need to know. Returning to the imagery of Rikuhu, that's the two eels that are devouring each other's tails, you have the one on top, Cahopa, representing life, and it is devouring the tail of Tangaloa, which is representing death. That means Cahopa is sustaining itself by eating Tangaloa. That means in order for life to be able to have sustenance and have energy, it's getting that energy from death itself. And this is just like how the wheel works. In order for life to flourish, there has to be souls in the underworld that can be carried over. And likewise, for Tangaloa to be able to sustain itself, it is feeding off of Cahopa. It is feeding off of life. So as the souls leave bodies, they go into the underworld, thus, feeding Tangaloa. This is why the imagery for Rikuhu is really accurate to not only the wheel, but it is associated deeply with Berath, who is in charge of this process and oversees it. Now, if you were instead to go to a continent called the Eastern Reach, and specifically to a region on that continent known as the Deerwood, you would very likely run into the native tribes there known as the Glanfathans. The Glanfathans have a different idea of what Berath is, and they have their own name and imagery to go with it. So what they call Berath is one of two names, and sometimes just the two names together. And I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm just going to give it my best shot. But the two names that they have for Berath is Benwen Enq or Enq Benwen. Now, those two things just mean life and death and life. So we have these two names for Berath, life and death and life, in the Glanfathan tongue. Associated with these two names is also some imagery, just like the Huana in the Deadfire archipelago. The imagery associated here, though, is a little more subtle. It's a little harder to see necessarily how it's related to Berath and the wheel. If you were to go through Pillars of Eternity 1 and you were exploring Glanfathan ruins, you might get a glimpse of some of this imagery. What the Glanfathans tend to do is they tend to set up these two skeletons on either side of a doorway or an archway. On one side, you have a skeleton that is a little more feminine in appearance, and it looks like the flesh is kind of growing back, as it were. And on the other side of the doorway, you'll have a masculine skeleton, and it looks like the flesh is sort of, rotting away. This touches on a concept that is deeply connected to Berath as a deity, and that is the idea of duality. If I could sum up Berath in one word, I would use the word duality. There's constantly this play between life and death, and up and down, and feminine and masculine, and living and dying. Berath is often compared to being a coin that has two different sides. Every coin has two different sides. But I can look at a Canadian loonie, because that's where I live, and on one side I will see a loon scribed onto the side of it. That's why we call it a loonie. And on the other side, if I had it next to me, I'd be able to tell you I would probably see Her Majesty the Queen. And so there are two distinct images on this coin, and yet the coin can't exist unless both sides exist completely. Of course, I could take a file and I could file away the image on one side of the coin, but that isn't me removing that side from existence. That's just me taking the image off of it. If one of those sides of the coin were to be removed, then the coin would cease to exist. And it's the same idea with all of these dual natures that Berath represents. When you look at the two skeletons, you have a masculine skeleton and a feminine skeleton, as well as one that looks like it's coming back to life, whereas the other one looks like it's dying. You constantly have this duality going on. Now, how it's associated to the wheel, which is the best imagery and the best metaphor for Berath, it's a little subtle, like I mentioned, but it's there. So I want you to picture that you're standing in front of an archway, and on the left side of the archway is the feminine skeleton whose flesh is growing back, and on the right side of the archway is the masculine skeleton whose flesh is fading away. You walk towards the archway and through it, and after you walk a little bit past, you turn around. Now you'll notice that all of the same set pieces are there. You have the two skeletons and you have the archway, but the orientation has now changed. Instead of the feminine skeleton on your left, now it's the masculine skeleton, and now the feminine skeleton is to your right. And if you were to walk back through that archway and turn around, then you would be where you started. This is a ritual that one could perform in the Glanfathan tribes. I don't know if they did, but this is a ritual they could perform that represents the wheel. As you travel from one side of the archway to the other, it's almost like your soul being in that state of life, the state of living, and it goes through the doorway, through the portal that is represented by the archway, and to the other side of the underworld, or where death is. This is where we can see the domains of portals and doorways really coming into play with Berath. And so that soul that's on the other side now, it's in a state of death, turns around, it can walk through that same archway and enter back into life. And on it goes. It doesn't look cyclical like a circle, but it is cyclical in a technical sense. Now, if you were to travel to anywhere that has to do with Old Valia, such as the Valian Republics or the city of Grand Valia itself, you would learn that the Valians refer to Berath as Sirono. Unfortunately, that's really all the information we have about why they call her that, or why they call it that, But hopefully, maybe in Avowed, we will learn a little bit more about what it means. There's one last name that Berath will go by, and it really emphasizes this twinned aspect of Berath. And it's the two manifestations that Berath is often associated with. Now, this is the reason that I have the proclivity to refer to Berath as a she. And that is because of these two manifestations, you interact with one of them in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. In fact, it's the first thing you arguably do. It's the first substantial thing that you actually do in the game, is your character, well, your spirit, or the soul of your character anyways, is sitting across the table from the Pallid Knight and the Usher. The Pallid Knight is this young, pale-skinned woman in thick, gaunt black armor. And off to her right, behind her, at least at the start of the Deadfire game, is the Usher. is this wrinkled old man wearing robes. You'll speak with the Pallid Knight, and she will speak back to you. However, the Usher, we learn by reading some of the books in the game, will never speak. Now, this is a manifestation of Berath, which means that the Pallid Knight and the Usher have appeared in Eora before, whether physically in the world or in visions or dreams to specific creatures. The gods have decided to not interact with Eora too much in contemporary times to allow civilizations to make their own decisions and follow their own path, but there are legends and stories of interactions with the Pallid Knight and the Usher. So why might Berath manifest into the world? Let's say that you are living in the world of Eora, and you don't want to die. You don't want to submit your soul to the wheel. You want to keep on living this good life that you got. And so you extend your life magically, or unnaturally, in some way, shape, or form. Now, as you can imagine, this is rather upsetting to Berath, or at least insulting, because Berath oversees the wheel, this necessary natural process that gives life to new people in the future, and it maintains the sort of metaphysical processes in the underworld, where a lot of the gods get their energy from. So if you were avoiding putting your soul into the wheel, in a way, that is one of the most offensive things you can do. Like, you are making yourself such a priority that you are depriving somebody in the future the ability to be born with a soul. You see, like, you're just one person, but the principle of the matter of how much you're prioritizing yourself over this natural process, which is arguably more important than you. And so whether Berath takes it personally or not, it decides it's going to come after you. So let's keep going. Let's keep walking with this imagery. You are walking down a woodland highway, as are just traveling through a forest from one city to another. And, you're enjoying the second century of your human life, living far longer than you ought to have lived. And Berath decides, okay, this is the time and the place. I'm going to do something about it. As you're walking down this dirt and highway, you hear some rustling and some bushes off to your left. And so you're at the ready. You've been alive long enough to know that you got to be ready to take on someone as soon as you can, or flee if you have to. And out of those bushes walk this pale-skinned, thick black armored woman. And you look sort of perplexed at her, and she looks at you and says, "You are traveling on my master's road and must pay a toll." Now, I wonder whether or not Berath might say this, in a metaphorical sense. Like, you are treading on a path that goes against nature, and if you want to do that, then you're going to have to pay a toll, right? If you're going to be someone who thinks that they're above the wheel, then you better have some recompense for that. You better have some way of justifying it. So Berath says, "You must pay a toll for walking on my master's road." And then she tells you the toll, and it's impossible to pay. It's just, you can't do it, right? And so the only option is to sacrifice your life to them instead. So at this point, you have a few options. One, you can try to fight this person. It's just some woman in armor. I could take her, right? Yeah. Like, well, let's go for it. So you go take a swing at this pale-skinned woman in armor, and of course, maybe you don't know that's actually Berath in physical form. And so she blinks, and you turn into a gooey paste, and there, you're done. The second option is that you agree to pay the toll, but when you find out that the toll is impossible to pay, you submit and say, okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to get away. I can't fight you. I've lived long enough. I don't know what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to submit myself to you and be at your mercy. And of course, the Pallid Knight will blink and you'll turn into a gooey red paste again. Now, the last option you have, of course, is to just run. You'd be like, oh, this person looks like they know what they're doing. I'm not going to mess around. I'm going to leave. Maybe you know that it's Berath, or maybe you know that they know how to fight based on the armor. Either way, you turn tail and run, right? And so you're running down this path that you were originally walking up, and you're running and you're running. And you turn and look over your shoulder to see if they're giving chase, if she is pursuing you. And you can see in the distance that this Pallid Knight is just standing where they were, with their hand on the hilt of their sword, which is sheathed. You're like, yeah, they must think they can't catch me. All right, and then you turn to face the path. You didn't turn your head for more than half a second. You just wanted to do a quick check. But you turn to face the path that you're running down, and you swear that it was just a long, straight path for the longest time. But now you find yourself just about to run off of a cliff's edge, or at least a very steep decline. And so you run straight off this edge despite your attempt to stop, and you start rolling down the hill like Andy Samberg from Hot Shot, just going to and fro and tumbling and cracking yourself up against trees and rocks. You end up breaking both of your legs and your arms and a couple ribs in the process. You go over the last lip of this long decline, and bam, you land on something soft. But that soft thing starts letting out a yelp, and you open your eyes, painfully so, and see that you have landed on a baby bear, a bear cub. And not far from bear cub is Mama Bear. And so here you lay, broken arms, broken legs. Mama Bear gets up in the middle of a nap with her kids, and, nature takes its course. The camera pans out, and we see at the very top of this incline where you first fell down is the usher, this wrinkled old man in brown robes like Friar Tuck from Robin Hood, dusting his hands off for a job well done. The usher is the person that you will run into if you try to flee from the Pallid Knight from trying to enter you into the wheel. What the usher does is the usher creates circumstances by which you will meet your demise. Have you ever watched the movie Final Destination? That movie is basically the usher's work at play. Now, you might not run off a cliff that you thought wasn't there before. You might run all the way back home. And to celebrate your survival for another day, you go out to the local pub with a bunch of friends. And then someone tells a joke just as you're eating a grape and you choke and die. Like, that's the kind of thing that the usher would do to you. Or he might literally make it so that you're walking around at night, and unbeknownst to you, you trip and fall right into a hole in the ground. And, break your neck or something on the way down. And you've literally fallen into your own grave. This is what the usher will do. And that is because death is inevitable, right? That is one of the domains of Berath, after all, is inevitability. Even if Berath didn't intercede, statistically speaking, if you lived an infinite amount of time, if there was anything that could kill you, eventually it would happen. It's just like that whole monkey and a typewriter with an infinite amount of time thing will produce Shakespeare. If there's something that can kill you, even though you're living immortally, eventually that thing's going to happen, right? Statistically speaking. But I digress. And so these two manifestations are really just one manifestation of Berath, if you think about it, because they are often manifested together. They often appear together, which leads me to speculate. I wonder if they are like two separate puppets being played by one puppet master, which would be Berath. Or does the Pallid Knight and the Usher have distinct personalities? Like, do they have their own thoughts and volitions and stuff like that? It's an interesting thought, because is it one god, which is Berath, and are these two people? Or are they, they just vessels that Berath is inhabiting? I relate it a lot to, there's the Christian idea of God is a trinity, right? One God substance, and within that God substance is three people. It's confusing, but we have this really complex god, Berath, in this game, and try to relate it to things that you already know about. Regardless, either way, the Pallid Knight and the Usher are the first manifestations of Berath that you speak to in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, in the opening scene when you're determining your character's look and talking about the backstory and the whole setting for what's going on in the second game. Interestingly enough, if you go back to that scene in the Deadfire game, if you look at the environment around you, you are completely encircled by a tower of doorways. That's a neat little detail sticking to Berath's domains. And so that's everything that I have time for to talk about with Berath today. And we've talked a little bit about what Berath is and what Berath does, and touched on the names and the meanings behind Berath. But we still have yet to get into the personality and the priesthood and the godlikes of Berath. But I think we're going to postpone that for another episode. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of World of Eora, where we dive into the lore behind Berath and who or what it is and what it's responsible for. I hope you guys will tune in next time as we take a look a little bit more at the personality of Berath, as well as the priesthood and the godlikes. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. If you really liked this episode, please leave a rating or a review if it's possible, or reach out to me and let me know what you think. I always love feedback so that I can make this better and that I can connect with you guys, maybe add some new segments to the show. You can reach me on Twitter at World of Eora. That's WORLDOFEORA. Or you can email me directly to worldofaeora@gmail.com. Thank you again so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.